if you turn on Twitter the night of a UFC event, the amount of complaints that you'll get about like ESPN Plus, etc., is off the wall.
Whatever happens on the ground has two issues with it. The first one is that it's inherently harder to see. It's very popular with women training self-defense because a lot of strength positions in jiu-jitsu start with your back on the ground.
The history of crypto, like there hasn't been that much real consumer crypto traction outside of exchanges and speculation.
I'm Regan Bozeman, co-host of the Token Warrant, and today I'm joined by Carlos from BitKraft and OnlyLarping from Karate. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us on.
What's up, man? Pleasure to be here.
It's good to see you both. Maybe we can kick things off with just a round of introductions. Carlos, if you want to kick it off, how you got into crypto, a bit about BitKraft, what you invest in there, and we can go from there.
Sure. I got into crypto really through games. I had been following Bitcoin and Ethereum and had a little bit of exposure financially, mostly from reading Matt Levine. So I was a TradFi guy before. I was in private equity and growth. Matt Levine, when he started writing about Ethereum, that immediately resonated. It's like, okay, this is pretty cool, right? And it kept coming up in the newsletter, and I thought it was interesting to have some exposure to it, but very much at a long dated. I have no idea of what this is or where it will go, but it'd be cool to have some exposure to it. And I didn't really quite get it, I think, until I started working at BitKraft. At that point, I had done 5 years of private equity and growth. I had been doing games investing for about 2 years. Joined BitKraft originally on the Web2 fund. BitKraft is about $1 billion of AUM dedicated to the intersection of video games, interactive entertainment. 1/3 of our capital is in crypto funds, 2/3 is in Web2 funds. This is today. When I joined, we were a little bit smaller, and we were just beginning to deploy into crypto. Pierce Kicks, who's a venture partner for us now, was leading that strategy. And I started, I was pretty curious about what was going on. Asked Pierce if I could sit in some of the meetings. When I started getting pitched crypto through the lenses of MMORPGs, which I've always played a lot of these games, it immediately clicked because I'm very accustomed to having value in these games that I wanted to trade in and out of and couldn't, or in order for me to do so, I had to risk getting scammed on PayPal, abandoning a game that you've sunk 1,000 hours into and you know that there's demand for those assets, and the only way to unlock that financially for you is, again, through black markets. Being a big fan of a game like Eve, for example, and knowing how big economies are for that game and how much real world attention there is around that, and like people have full-time jobs, paid fiat in the real world to basically work within Eve. And so once I started seeing crypto through that context, I was like, oh, okay, like this is like an awesome consumer or an awesome application of this technology to a consumer product that I deeply care about. And so from then on, I was really in the crypto rabbit hole. Probably 6 months later, I was fully dedicated to our crypto strategy. About a year after that, we decided to expand into our second fund. At that point, I had done a handful of deals in our first fund, had done a lot of legwork, I think, in institutionalizing our approach to crypto and how we would think about the portfolio and how do we think about crypto investing as the market matures and perhaps gets more efficient versus the old, more Wild West days. And with it, I was given the opportunity to lead the strategy. So I've done that since 2022, leading crypto for BitKraft.
Reading Matt Levine is not an answer I've heard before in terms of someone getting into crypto. I mean, he's writing around FTX and like everything the last few years is he's a brilliant writer, and I think like frames this stuff in a very digestible way for people. When did he actually start writing about Ethereum?
Right after the Ethereum ICO, he was talking about smart contracts, and that is like when it began clicking for me, because it went from the world of Bitcoin, which obviously today I've come around significantly on it, right? But at the time, I think you end up borrowing a lot of opinions from the people that you are surrounded by, and at the time, I was in a decidedly anti-crypto, anti-Bitcoin environment where like I had a colleague once say that he liked Bitcoin and he was like shouted to like, I'm going to start paying your salary in Bitcoin, blah, blah, which frankly, they should have done. It would have been amazing for him. But I was very much like, yeah, this is cool, but it requires everyone to reach consensus and like why bother kind of thing. Versus because Matt Levine is formerly a lawyer, right? And so a lot of his newsletters have that feature of what happens when legal agreements break or people exploiting legal agreements. And so when the ICO happened, he starts writing about Ethereum, he was very focused on smart contracts and on how they might apply to all these esoteric legal / finance things that he'd write about. And the enforcement around that. And so that was the original angle with which he started writing. And then, of course, afterwards, much more cynical and everything else. But in the beginning, it was just like, hey, here's this smart contract thing. And here's how it would apply to all these financial transactions and how it would make them, whether permissionless or safer or whatever it may be. And that resonated. I thought that was pretty cool.
It's like a classic crypto rabbit hole journey, pure optimism, and then seeing how much nonsense and noise there could be in this space, and then just being like, this is all crazy. Yeah. And then hopefully there's, some kind of like flip back the other way. OnlyLarping, awesome to have you on. You would love to hear a bit about yourself to the extent you can do that without doxing, and then karate probably is like a more interesting history than most projects we have on here. So yeah, would love to like hear more about that.
Yeah, my pleasure. So actually, I also come from a private equity background and got introduced to crypto pretty early. I was in sort of like special situations private equity where you finance a bunch of like really messy things, which gives you an interesting perspective on assets and asset classes that are tough to finance. And through that, a friend and another very large TradFi fund introduced me to some people in the space back in 2014. And I quickly got super obsessed with it for a variety of reasons. Kind of one of the core learnings from doing special situations private equity is that if you can find an asset or an asset class that's like growing really quickly but tough to finance, it can be one of the best investments you can ever make. And so fell down the rabbit hole, invested a bunch of my own money, started a company in 2014 that's still around today in the space, and got pretty lucky with it all. It allowed me to do a bunch of my own things, including funding and help start Karate Combat back in 2018. Karate Combat itself was not started to be a crypto project. In fact, for the first 5 years or so of the league, there was almost no overlap with crypto. But now, about 3 years ago, we came up with an idea we fell in love with, and I've been doing this full time, helping to lead the Web3 effort, especially.
No, it would be great to like understand the history of the league, and then like the Venn diagram of like sports and crypto has not historically been that large. So yeah, just like how the league kind of like went in this direction, and maybe a high level of what that looks like today.
Sure. I'll actually touch on your latter question first. I think that the Venn diagram between sports and crypto is larger than it feels from like CT or from like the VC side of crypto, because there's been some pretty big success stories at the intersection. I mean, Top Shot's like arguably kicked off the NFT bubble, I think. Stake is one of the most successful kind of crypto native companies out there. So Rare is also a pretty successful company. So for one reason or another, there hasn't been that much investment put into the space, but I think you've seen like a lot of really good consumer crypto traction at the intersection. And, and in the history of crypto, like there hasn't been that much real consumer crypto traction outside of exchanges and speculation. So I actually think the intersection is pretty interesting. On Karate Combat itself, so the league was started in early 2018 by one of my best buddies from college. And we built it together to build a sports league for the next generation of fans, like across every vector. Younger people watch sports completely differently. They're watching on their phone. A lot of them are just watching highlights on social media. They're much more likely to gamble on sports. They grew up using social media and playing games, and they're not used to sitting on the couch for 4 hours passively. And so we built the league for them. So for instance, on distribution, absolutely zero paywall, and not just zero paywall, but like we make it as easy to watch as humanly possible. So like pretty much every streaming and social media platform, if there's a Karate Combat event live, you can open up your phone and it will be on streaming. On the rule set itself, the format is called Karate Combat, but the North Star there is just like make the most entertaining, fast-paced fight rule set that can exist. It ends up looking a lot like the UFC without grappling. Carlos is a huge jiu-jitsu nut, but the biggest complaint from casual fight fans when they watch the UFC is the time on the ground. So we take that out, we make the rounds shorter, we make the scoring favor aggression, and you get tons of knockouts. It's really fun to watch. On production, we try and make every event look like a real-life version of a unique level in a video game. Most of the events we film in front of 3D VFX environments, and then about a third of the events we have in these outstanding real-world locations. So the end product is really differentiated from really any other sport, let alone combat sport out there. Lastly is the Web3 side of things. The thesis on the Web3 side was Karate Combat has this very large awareness. We got like 6 million followers. We get hundreds of millions of views on the internet every month. But converting that awareness to like true super fandom, the people who are willing to travel to events, spend money on events, etc., that conversion is super hard, and every sport struggles with it. The thing most people will come in and tell you, like unsolicited advice when you have a young sports league, is like, hey, you should make all this great content on like the behind the scenes of all these athletes that people don't know that well. But no matter how good the content is on that side, like it's almost impossible to get anybody to watch content about an athlete they don't know that well. And so the thesis was really around our demographic. We went after this younger demo. Most of our fans are male, kind of 20 to 35 years old. And if you poll them, almost half of them will tell you that they don't enjoy watching sports unless they have a bet on it. And so the dream was get all these people a little financial upside on every fight so that they can hopefully do this self-started research into the names and narratives of these slightly lesser known fighters, because that's what it takes to get someone to really, truly emotionally buy in about a sporting event.
It's a fascinating story. Like, yeah, I think trying to like supercharge kind of an existing business with crypto and trying to give fans ownership and kind of more economic upside in it. It's a really interesting angle. I'm curious, like what, if you're running like a nascent sports league, like there's probably not that many that at least like other people are, like most people are aware of. I'm curious, like what does the trajectory look like if that business works? And then maybe like how do you think the crypto angle kind of supercharges that or maybe leads you to like a different outcome?
I mean, in some ways, the UFC is one of the best examples of what a nascent sports league can turn into, because it's not that much more than 30 years old. They've been able to build an organization, even if you strip out like kind of their partner org, that's like over $10 billion market cap, or what would equate to a $10 billion FTV in crypto world. And so there's a lot of fixed costs in sports, but if you can get the flywheel going, they can grow tremendously quickly to tremendous scale. The UFC claims to have 600 million fans globally. We believe that we've built a sports format that can actually be more mainstream than the UFC. One thing I like to point to is that it seems that like women love coming to karate combat events and watching karate combat events, probably much more so than the UFC for a variety of reasons. That's half the population of the world. In terms of like competition for fight sport eyeballs, the UFC is only on the air 3 to 4 times a month. Combat sports fans, many of them would watch combat sports every single day if you let them. So the upside, the potential upside is very, very large and not that long a time period. It's not something that has to take 100 years. If you can kind of cross the chasm into mainstream attention, it can grow into something very large very quickly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, imagine like, I think what you've seen with UFC is like, these fight packages, like the pay-per-view revenue is massive. You look at how like all the reorientation going around in college sports, college football specifically, and all these conferences shaking up. It's generally all about TV rights, right? Like those are like what dominates revenue. You guys have taken a very different approach business model wise, where it's much more about giving it away. Maybe curious to kind of like where you see the end game in terms of like how the league makes money.
So it's not guaranteed that works, but it is like kind of obvious opportunity to try. All of these traditional sports are locked up behind paywalls, with a lot of UX friction. Like if you turn on Twitter the night of a UFC event, like the amount of complaints that you'll get about like ESPN Plus, et cetera, is off the wall. And so there is a chance, I'm not saying that we can necessarily pull it off forever, but there is a chance that if you can grow a sports league like this without ever charging for content, it is a path to eclipse like the existing sports properties in the world. If you make it extraordinarily easy for every single person on earth with like zero UX barrier, and I do think the UX barrier is sort of the biggest thing here, above and beyond sort of like the cost of watching the content. If you can like reduce the UX barrier to nothing, and it has mainstream attention on it, like the amount of eyeballs you can get on it are like astronomical, right? And so that is the goal, that is the hope, that we could sort of like leapfrog these existing sports properties by making it extraordinarily easy to watch. Is something that they can't turn around and do themselves. They're locked in. Their financial structures are locked in. They can't go and wipe out 70% of their revenue and stream on every single site. So if we make it work, we will have a massive advantage that they can't really compete with.
Yeah, it's like the innovator's dilemma, but they have these fixed costs,
yes,
and you guys are gonna challenge them. With just like a different business model. Carlos, maybe kicking it back to you, like how did you first hear about karate combat? Maybe like what BitKraft's involvement has been and kind of thesis at a high level.
Yeah, sure. So I first spoke to OnlyLarping December of 22. December 21 or 22? Whatever, but a year before we did the deal. So we did the deal early last year, so December of 21 going into 22, because we watched it for about a year before doing the deal. At the time, they weren't live yet, but the product immediately resonated with me with the visuals and with the no jiu-jitsu, right? Like this complaint of the average consumer booing when a fight goes to the ground is something I'm very familiar with from watching fights. I've been in jiu-jitsu now for 9 years, which means I tend to be on the butt of those jokes, right? Around like how, your sport is useless and you just sit on the ground and do nothing. And blah, blah. So I'm like quite familiar with the energy around that. And if you look at the story of the UFC was started by the Gracie family. The same family that invented Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu started the UFC back in the early 90s to prove that Jiu-Jitsu was the best martial art in the world. They used to get into fights in gyms and raid gyms, and then they found a more institutional, high-profile way of doing it, which was just inviting people to these open competitions, and you would have the karate guy versus the jiu-jitsu guy versus taekwondo guy versus the wrestling guy. It's proof now, this is no longer an open question, that jiu-jitsu and wrestling are the best bases for winning at the UFC. That's why you see, Khabib from a wrestling background, John Jones wrestling background, Anderson Silva, exception there, karate, but like George St. Pierre, shoot boxing, so like a lot of wrestling. So a lot of the champions have skewed towards wrestling and jiu-jitsu, and it's good for those martial arts, but it also creates fights that have progressively become, I would argue, less exciting. They're famous and there's awareness on the sport, but the old UFC fights are crazy. The new UFC fights, sometimes they're crazy, but the average UFC fight is no longer that exciting. The thing is, the average consumer of the UFC is a male over the age of 30 or 35 that deeply cares about jiu-jitsu, that cares about where that martial art come from. And the UFC will never let go of that. And so I was familiar with the problem set and with like the nature of why jiu-jitsu will always be a part of the UFC. As the nature of the sport, when I first heard the pitch, I thought it was cool. It wasn't there yet for us because it wasn't live, and monetization wasn't as good yet. But then that entire year, I started seeing more and more highlight reels on Instagram because I follow a lot of these fight pages, right? And I would see crazy knockouts on Karate Combat. And the interesting thing about those highlights is, like, one, they kept Karate Combat top of mind for me, but two, I'm served martial arts reels all the time. And if I'm served a traditional MMA league I often will look at the logos on the floor or the fighters, because I don't follow it that closely, to try to understand if that fight is happening in the PFL or One Championship or UFC or Bellator, when that was going on. So you kind of like, they all look like an octagon. They all look like the same sport. And you're like, oh, like what promotion was this? There has never been a case, and there will never be a case, in which I'm served or anyone else has served a highlight reel from Karate Combat, and they don't know it's Karate Combat. It is highly differentiated because of the visuals of the pit and because of the martial arts. And so when KC came back to us, then in December of 22, I guess, which is when we started looking at the deal again, I was already familiar with it. I had seen it grow. It had started doing live fights, which had been huge for engagement and opening up the betting opportunities and the up-only opportunities. And then I started going around and asking friends, and, have you heard of Karate Combat? And there were only two answers. They would either not have heard of it, which was a fair amount of them, or they would say, it's the one that looks like Street Fighter, the one that looks like Mortal Kombat, the crazy one with the pit and the walls and whatever. And so it was very, very clear that anyone that knew what it was had a very strong affinity to the media format, to what made them special. It wasn't like, oh, they have this big name fighter fighting for them. People had no idea who was fighting for them, but they understood the format extremely well. And so at that point, revenue had increased, I think, like tenfold basically from a year before. The product was financially in a much better place. It was a bear market in crypto, which created a better entry opportunity for us on the price side. And I had just more and more people around me saying this is awesome, and they've been tracking it. And the rest is history. I guess in terms of your, how involved we've been, I think across BitKraft, the goal that we have is that each of us, there's 5 of us on the team, 4, and there's one guy starting here soon. But there's four allocators on the team, in the crypto team currently. And the goal is that each one of us will do 2 to 3 deals a year. And that will roll up to something like a 10 or 12 portfolio, or 10 or 12 companies a year. We'll deploy the fund over roughly 3 years. So we'll end up with something between 30 and 40 companies in this fund. That has always been the plan. And the goal is that me, Carlos, as an individual, not as the person that runs the crypto fund, I am only going to invest in people that I want to spend significant amounts of time with. And that's the same for John and for Justin and for Jamie. And so from the moment that I invested in KC, it has been deeply interesting to me to spend as much time with the team as I can. And I've helped them with whatever they needed. Probably the most tangible thing is helping them start the jiu-jitsu product, which has been doing super well. And came out of nowhere. I had no expectation of making this kind of product contribution, but yeah, like I'm involved. I speak to OnlyLarping probably 5 times a week on a slow week.
Thank you.
Well, so yeah, it sounds like you guys are living, definitely fulfilling the promise of value add investors. And like, I'm admittedly very not deep on like UFC and the rule set there. Can you just like explain at a high level why people don't like the grappling, and then maybe like what the karate jiu-jitsu product looks like and how that's different from what's going on in UFC?
Sure. So whatever happens on the ground has 2 issues with it. The first one is that it's inherently harder to see. You see 2 dudes or 2 women fighting on the ground, and the positional advantage that someone has, even for an expert, sometimes is hard to understand because you don't know if an arm is trapped on the back this way, or if the hand maybe is this way and they're going to pull their elbow out. So it's a little bit harder to understand. The other piece of it is, if you don't understand, and there's a lot of situations in which you may think someone has positional advantage and they don't, like jiu-jitsu, for example, is very popular with women training self-defense, because a lot of strength positions in jiu-jitsu start with your back on the ground. And so you can look at someone who has their back on the ground and think they're about to lose, and in fact, they're about to win. And so it's hard for someone to come in and understand what's going on. There's rarely any debate of who's winning and who's losing when someone is getting punched on the face. You see it, you know it. This guy's winning. This guy's getting punched in the face. This guy's doing the punching, right? And kicking and all of that. It's way more higher octane. And so when you're on the ground, things take longer, they're slow, they're hard to understand. You're having to guess a little bit about positional advantages, or you don't know what positional advantages are. and then all of a sudden a submission happens and you're like, oh my God, what happened? I totally missed that. Versus striking, everyone understands striking. Like people have been striking for way longer than they've been doing elaborate, could join yoga, right? Like people say jiu-jitsu is involuntary yoga. So people have been doing striking for way longer than involuntary yoga. It's easy for normies to understand. And so for the karate combat rule set, 3 rounds of 3 minutes, versus 3 rounds of 5 minutes, except for championships, which would be 5 of 5 in the UFC and 5 of 3 in KC. If you look at your VO2 max as a fighter, a 3-minute effort is significantly faster or easier than a 5-minute effort. And so it allows people to have more gas in the tank. You don't have takedowns. The rule set, since we invested, there have been a number of governance proposals that were passed with the community to add elbows and to change a bunch of other rules that have only made it more fast-paced. But it's super intense. It has a very high knockout rate. The scoring criteria, you are scored on how much aggression you're putting forth, not just on how many significant strikes you're landing. And so it's in your advantage to be all out all the time throwing punches. These are extremely skilled people, Olympic athletes, world champions from other promotions. So it doesn't look like a drunk brawl, but it certainly is like a very high-paced fight. And so for a normie to come in and look at that product, it is extremely easy to understand. It's easy to consume, and they're consuming it on all this like native social media without it being behind a paywall. Or oftentimes they're consuming it because their favorite influencer has decided to stream the fight on their own choice, which we want, right? Like if you're a streamer and you want to stream the UFC, they're not going to let you. But if you want to do the Saturday night watch party streaming KC, Michael Bisping, for example, former UFC, I think he's a champion, but certainly like a former high-profile UFC guy, did it recently, and we love it. We love to see it. So that's basically the core rule and why it matters.
That's super helpful context, and I think I'm sure there's plenty of crypto nerds listening who are not as familiar with the fight rule set. Maybe taking it to like karate today and what that looks like. OnlyLarping, if you want to like maybe just start with kind of like how the league is governed today, what the token does, what role that plays, and then maybe where you see, things going in that direction in the future.
I was saying I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the name of the podcast being Token Warrant. I think when we did the deal with Carlos, we were probably like one of the only deals almost like in a year of that size that didn't do like equity plus Token Warrant. We did something pretty crazy. My co-founder and I, we had owned almost the entirety of the league because we built the league with our own money. And having been in crypto for a decade and also having spent a lot of time in corporate structuring, just felt very strongly that if we were going to do this to build up on the gaming, we were going to do it right. And we were going to kind of eliminate the entire equity structure of the league. So before we launched the Karate token, we sold the entire league to an ownerless Cayman foundation. We structured the foundation such that it can actually be governed by the token holders. A series of like professional Cayman directors at the Cayman Foundation that take direction from the token holders about almost everything. And we wiped out all the old equity of the league. So first and foremost, like the utility of the Karate token is governance. But we really did it all to build up on the gaming, which is this sort of no loss sweepstakes on every fight. The thesis behind the Web3 product here. So the core utilities of Karate today are number 1, governance. Number 2, the ability to earn additional tokens by accurately predicting fight outcomes. And number 3, because nobody owns the league, all the perks that traditionally go to owners of sports properties should really flow to the token holders. One of the big reasons people buy sports properties are those like front row seats, the trips to the events, the access to talent, and we give away those types of things based on where you are on our up on the gaming leaderboard. So that's the current utility of the token, but we expect it to expand with league progress and token holder input.
It's super interesting. Can you elaborate on maybe like up only gaming?
Yes. So up only gaming is really kind of the reason behind all of this madness. As I mentioned earlier, the thesis was to get a little financial upside on each fight to every fan, to get them researching the fighters ahead of time. It's sort of a DeFi idea attached to a sports league. The way it works is before each event, every karate token holder very easily in our native mobile apps or web apps can vote on which fighters they think are going to win. The more tokens you have, the more votes you have. When you vote on winning fighters, you earn a little bit more karate from a fixed karate prize pool on each event. When you vote on losing fighters, though, nothing happens. The payouts and the implied odds are set pari-mutuel. The league doesn't take a vig or anything like that. Really, we're trying to use like these fixed karate prize pools as incentive to get people to like go do the research on the fighters and then keep them hyper engaged during the events because they have the chance to win.
So, Carlos, kicking it to you. I mean, I'm curious kind of how y'all underwrite the token and think about it long term in terms of just like value accrual, where it fits into karate, where you see it fitting in kind of like the many, many thousands of tokens that exist today.
Yeah, sure. I think it's probably helpful to first establish some baseline comps for the value of the business versus like the Web2 world. And so UFC is the clear market leader in the category. It's roughly a $10 billion plus enterprise, as OnlyLarping had mentioned earlier. So it sits, very outside of the comps. But the more relevant ones would be PFL and One Championship. They've both been around for a number of years. They both are trying to do some spin on the UFC. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the product doesn't look that visually distinct. It's still an octagon. It's still MMA. In our view, not sufficiently differentiated. But both of those businesses have taken significant outside capital over the years. Most recently, One Championship raised, I believe, from Qatar at a $1.3 billion valuation. PFL, I think, sits somewhere between $750 to $1 billion. And so those businesses, as we look across social traffic, growth, just basic relevance in the traditional MMA world right now, it feels like KC is growing faster. It's already larger than them in some categories of media. It has awareness. It has differentiation. And so we have the view that this property should be trending towards, at a minimum, the value of those comps, right? And so versus where the token is today, I think that we've been buyers of the token after the private investment in the liquid markets, and that stems from our view. I guess no investment advice, do your own research, blah blah. But our view of what the comps in the space are. I think the challenge, of course, ends up being getting token markets to recognize that value. I think token markets oftentimes are inefficient to the upside, like, for example, with a lot of multi-billion-dollar infrastructure that has no users or real applications on top. And I think rarely or sometimes these markets are inefficient to the downside. I think two things have been negative to the KC token. And it's easy for me to have this conversation with like OnlyLarping here because we talk about this stuff all the time. It's not news to us, right? I think the first one is, earlier OnlyLarping was talking about how they sold. The thing that he left out is the founders had put about $35 million of their own money into the league. This is public information. And they sold all these assets into the ownerless foundation. And there's nowhere for value to accrue except for to the token. There's no equity entity. There's nothing that's receiving media rights or monetizing IP rights outside of the token. And perhaps a mistake that we made in our own underwriting early on was to think that because there was no equity entity, that was a very simple answer. Where does the value accrue? It accrues to the token. There's nowhere else for the value to accrue. But I think in the context of crypto, it's so rare, actually, that people are doing the proper foundation setup and having all of the assets in the nonprofit. That's simply saying it accrues to the token because there's nowhere else that can accrue. I don't think has been a message that has resonated particularly well, which then takes us to the next piece of it, which would be how do we increase the utility of the token? How do we increase distribution of the token? And then how do we facilitate some of the value messaging around the assets that KC has built? And for that, a lot of what we're paying attention to is this next evolution of the product with up only or the up chain. And the opportunity for the upchain is twofold. First, from a utility perspective, the product has been quite hamstrung by the current architecture being snapshot-based for how up-only bets are placed, right? And so you have the app, about 130,000 people are currently using the mobile app to place bets on these fights. You get push notification 3 hours before the event. It starts about 2 hours before the event, goes up until 3 hours, and it says votes are about to close. Cast your votes. And then the vote's closed. The issue is the majority of the viewership is happening during the fight. And so your call to action during the fight of saying download the Karate Combat app and get KC tokens to bet on the next event is significantly weaker than to say get these tokens and start betting now. And I also think that you leave a lot of transactional volume on the table because people aren't able to switch their bets during the fight. And so you can't bet when it's live. You can't bet when you start watching the stream. You can't bet or you can't change your mind on bets as the fights are happening. I think that the switch to the up-only chain and switching to a proper stake-based model opens up the live betting opportunity. I'm using betting here. It's up-only betting, right? But it's easier this way. But it opens up the live betting opportunity, which drives utility. I think it also improves the conversion rate. So if you think about the Dubai fight had about 50 million views, 50 million views, and it had about 100,000 bettors on the app. That's a very, very, very small conversion. I think an app update that allows people to bet live and allows people to be betting back and forth and like all these things will already improve conversion. If it improves conversion, improves demand for the token. There should be a much more significant driver of demand for the token as the product gets better. And then the other thing that it opens up that is quite frustrating is, for example, when Dave Hoffman was supposed to fight Nick Carter, a fight that we're all still eagerly waiting for it to happen. As soon as the fight was announced, the first market that was created for the fight was on Polymarket. And so you have Polymarket stealing betting float from, not stealing in a bad way, right? Like they're doing, like there's nothing wrong with that, but they're stealing betting float from our fights because we don't open our snapshot until a week or two before the fight. And so there should be a model where people can stake on fights much earlier, where perhaps there's incentivization for keeping your token staked between fights instead of just perhaps buying them before a fight, betting, and then selling a piece. And so I think that there's a lot of engineering around the token to be done to improve the utility of it during, before, and after the fights. And with improving utility, I think that we'll see significant demand. So that's the first part. The second thing with Up Only is KC has spent a lot of resources to develop this proprietary technology stack that, at the tail end of it has enabled them to have an App Store compliant app with 130,000 users. Now, for context, Polymarket has about 350,000 bettors. Way more volume to be fair. But you're talking about something that has about a third of the bettors of Polymarket in this super under-optimized way, right? So it should be able to significantly increase. We know that crypto values infrastructure more than applications. We, as a firm, personally don't think that that's going to be the case forever. But we do think that there's this unlocked or latent infrastructure value within KC that is not recognized. By spinning off the infrastructure into Upchain and allowing people to basically have a software licensing model where if you want to use the Up-only stack, the mobile app, like all that goes into the integration between the on-chain elements and the mobile app, if you want to do that, build on the Up-only chain, you get access to this technology for free. And you will also have a token that very quickly spells out infrastructure, right? And so the KC value, if you think about from a sum of the parts analysis, I think spinning off that asset into its own chain, given how crypto markets today value infrastructure, is another opportunity for value creation. And I think that what's been discussed is 30% of the Up-only tokens will go to the KC token holders. It hasn't been decided exactly how. 10% will go to the treasury of KC itself, right? So to the token holders, but indirectly. And so that's like the other opportunity that, we would expect to play out at some time next year. I think personally, I'm far more curious and excited for the utility opportunity because that just feels so much more real than value engineering around infrastructure versus not. But of course, there is a valuable infrastructure asset that having it on its own chain should be beneficial to other builders in the space. And if we can help make that happen, I think that's great.
I feel like you just laid out some of the karate product roadmap here, which is awesome to hear. Yeah, I think one of the karate, it's like such a unique asset, right? And that like it both is this like ownership in the league element. You also use it for gambling. And I was joking with Dave that right now it's like the token is live. The token's useful 3 or 4 hours a month, which is it's actually way more useful than most tokens. But because you kind of set this parameter, of when you can actively use it, it just mentally, it's a little bit harder to digest. And it still is a very one-of-one asset. Yeah, I think the live.
Yeah, we're hoping to change that for sure.
Yeah.
One of the big inspirations behind spinning out the infrastructure, as Carlos says, is like Karate Combat's incredibly intrinsically motivated to spread up on the gaming. Number one, everyone in the world knows what gambling is. A few 100,000 people max like know what up on the gaming is. We're not going to like get up on the gaming into the dictionary ourselves anytime soon. But if we can get 10 or 100 other projects copying what we did, it can really eliminate a lot of the education barriers around up on the gaming, which I think are quite significant. Also, if we do it right and we bring on other quality projects with millions of fans, we should be able to share users pretty easily. And there's not that many places in the consumer crypto ecosystem with kind of millions of real people doing transactions. So it could be quite material and could really catalyze kind of the next leg up and growth of users for up on the gaming. And lastly, kind of where you were going from a crypto capital market standpoint, it's good to be a trailblazer. You really do want to be the first in any vertical, but you don't want to be the first forever or the only forever.
Maybe just like contextualizing for listeners and like, kind of expanding on like the up only chain. Who do you think are like ideal customers for that product? Is it like more kind of like up and coming sports leagues where it's like, okay, maybe crypto is kind of like an accelerant, like esports or something like that? You think be use case?
Yeah, I'll let Carlos speak on esports because he's closer to the whole industry. But I actually think the market size is way larger than people like kind of originally think about. If you ask anybody about this, at least in America, they're like, oh, well, it's going to be like super hard to get like the NFL or NBA or MLB on here, right? But there's actually like 60,000 sports leagues in the world. Many of them are in places at least, predating the election that were considerably more comfortable with crypto. And it's not just sports leagues. It also works with teams. It should work similarly with esports or esports teams. And also there's a huge value prop, I believe, with fantasy sports and e-casinos as well. So I think that the core product is very malleable. I mean, if you look at like kind of the breadth of applications that people are using stuff like Joke Race for, people come up with all crazy ideas for stuff like this. We ourselves did an up-only poker night. So we had put together this kind of just marketing idea, a poker tournament between a couple of the biggest poker players in the world, some people from the MMA space, a couple of really huge athletes like Uriah Hall, and a couple of people from the crypto world. And 2 days before, we're like, man, we should really be doing an up-only poker night on this. And we had no time for development. The only thing we could do is like change the content that sits in the apps, and it worked perfectly. We notified everybody like, I don't know, a few hours before the snapshot, and we got 30,000 people playing. I think the range of application is very broad. I mean, even talking to some meme coins that, are looking to add utility, looking to do, like hamster racing 3.0 type of thing.
I've seen the hamster racing thing, which is hilarious.
Yeah. I mean, 2 summers ago, it like took over CT for like an entire week, right?
All right, maybe that could be the first upchain customer.
Honestly, if someone doesn't do hamster racing 3.0, which is probably like you turn up the dial on hamster racing like 10x, like we're gonna incubate it for sure. Because like if you I'm sure there will be a meme coin that launches on Up, and why wouldn't they have their own application and be running the most ridiculous contest you possibly can think of once a week?
Knowing crypto, I'm sure we'll push it to its natural extreme. Maybe just to like wrap this up and kind of tie it up, like OnlyLarping, like what's coming up for karate for upchain over the next year? Like what should people be looking out for?
Sure. So right now, we're in the process of taking our whole tech stack, which is like native mobile apps across iOS and Android, a web app that you can use with any wallet, a backend that allows the sport to run on chain, airdrop engine, analytics engine, etc. And we're making it really clean. We're modularizing it. As Carlos mentioned, we're also switching from snapshot-based voting to staking-based voting, and we're also taking the apps multi-chain. And so that is like the major development push over the next call it 3 to 4, 5 months. Alongside of it, we're also developing the L2 called Up, but really a lot of the development is getting all of this front end software in a place where we can very easily hand the code over to external developers, which they get for free, by the way, allow them to reskin it, add, remove features, and launch their own apps in the app stores. They should be able to do this like within the course of 2 to 4 weeks. We've estimated that the cost to a project is like $30,000 of development or less, just depending how much they want to do. If they literally just want to like swap out the icons and like the pictures and stuff, it's like much less. So that's like the major development push right now, is making it easy enough for any other project to launch their own apps in the app stores, to launch their own versions of Up Only Gaming on iOS and Android.
Awesome. I'm really excited to see what people do with it. And then, just for the two of you guys, like, what's the best place for people to reach out to you, follow along?
I mean, for better or worse, Twitter at OnlyLarping, probably for myself.
For me, Telegram, CGP_BTK, or Carlos at BitKraft.vc.
Awesome. Guys, really appreciate you coming along. This was a lot of fun, and really excited to see the next karate fight.
Miami coming up.
Yep.